They were told the traitors would hang, that women who betrayed Italy for German lovers deserved death, not mercy. But when the convoy of Italian prisoners rolled into Camp Florence, Arizona in October 1944, the American guards froze. Among the women in torn fascist uniforms stood one whose belly swelled unmistakably beneath her jacket. She was barely 23, her dark hair matted with dust, her eyes hollow with fear. She expected execution. She expected rage. Instead, she got a blanket, hot soup, and 2 young soldiers from Texas who stood guard at her door, not to imprison her, but to protect her from the others. If this story moves you, hit that like button now and subscribe, because what happened next challenged everything. These soldiers thought they knew about war, loyalty, and mercy. The train had traveled for 8 days from the East Coast, its wooden cars rattling through mountains and deserts, carrying human cargo that nobody wanted. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. These were Italian women, members of the Fascist Auxiliary Corps, the Ausiliary, who had served Mussolini's dying regime as radio operators, nurses, clerks, and propagandists. When Italy switched sides in 1943, these women became enemies of both the Allies and their own countrymen. The partisans hunted them, the Germans abandoned them, and the Americans, unclear what to do with female prisoners, shipped them across the Atlantic to remote camps in the American Southwest. The Arizona heat hit them like a wall when the train doors opened. After the damp cold of holding cells in New York, the October desert sun felt like punishment. The women descended slowly, their legs weak from confinement, their eyes squinting against the brightness. There were 42 of them in this transport. Typists, switchboard operators, a former teacher who had written speeches for the Fascist Youth League, a seamstress who had mended SS uniforms in Milan. Most were between 19 and 30. All wore versions of the same gray-green uniform, now filthy, torn, patched with different fabrics. Camp Florence sat in flat scrubland dotted with mesquite and cactus, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. To the east, the Galiuro Mountains rose purple in the distance. To the west, nothing but sand and sky. The camp itself looked hastily built. Rows of wooden barracks with tin roofs, a mess hall, a medical building, administration offices, and guard quarters. American flags snapped in the dry wind. The women stood in a ragged line beside the train as guards counted them, checked manifests, and assigned barracks numbers. Some of the women wept quietly. Others stared at the ground. A few maintained defiant expressions, chins lifted, eyes hard, clinging to whatever pride remained. That is when Sergeant Michael Torres noticed her. He was 26, a farm boy from outside San Antonio, broad-shouldered and sunburned, with a thick mustache and calm brown eyes. He had been checking names on a clipboard when he saw the woman near the end of the line sway slightly, her hand moving to steady herself against the train car. She was taller than most of the others, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that held a strange mixture of exhaustion and wariness. But it was her stomach that made Torres stop mid-word. Even beneath the loose jacket, the curve was unmistakable. He caught the eye of Private Danny Kaufman, a skinny kid from Brooklyn who had been assigned to the camp after washing out of paratrooper training due to a bum knee. Kaufman followed Torres's gaze, and his eyes widened. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. "Is she—" Torres nodded slowly. The 2 men exchanged looks. This complicated everything. Pregnant prisoners were not covered in any manual they had read. And pregnant. Prisoners carrying enemy children? That was uncharted territory. The woman's name, they would learn, was Giulia Rossi. She was 23 years old, from a village outside Turin. She had worked as a translator for the German command in northern Italy, assigned to a Wehrmacht logistics office. There she had met Hauptmann Dieter Wolf, a supply officer from Bavaria, serious, methodical, 13 years older than her. They had fallen in love in the way people do during wartime, quickly and desperately, stealing moments between air raids and retreats. When Italy changed sides, when the Germans became occupiers instead of allies, Giulia had a choice. She chose Dieter. That choice would define the rest of her life. By the time British forces captured her unit in the spring of 1944, Dieter was dead, killed by partisan ambush on a mountain road. Giulia was 3 months pregnant and alone. The British did not know what to do with her. The Italian partisans wanted her dead. Collaborators were being shot in village squares, their heads shaved, their bodies left as warnings. So the British shipped her to an American processing center, and the Americans, equally baffled, sent her across the ocean with the other fascist women. Nobody asked if she wanted to keep the baby, nobody asked her anything. They simply moved her from cell to ship to train to desert, another problem in a war filled with problems. Now she stood in the Arizona sun, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by women who whispered behind her back and guards who did not know whether to pity her or despise her. Sergeant Torres watched as she was led toward the processing building with the others. She walked slowly, one hand on her belly, the other clutching a small cloth bag that contained everything she owned. Her face was blank, carefully neutral, but her eyes darted constantly, watching the other prisoners, watching the guards, looking for danger in every shadow. She had learned the hard way that survival meant staying alert. and she had learned that carrying a German officer's child in a world that hated Germans meant she was a target, always. Torres made a decision in that moment. He did not know if it was the right decision, he did not know if it would get him in trouble, but he knew that whatever else this woman was, traitor, collaborator, enemy, she was also heavily pregnant and terrified, and that meant something had to be done. He turned to Kaufman. "Go find Captain Henderson," he said quietly. "Tell him we have a situation, and tell him we need to keep her separate from the others, for her own safety." Kaufman nodded and jogged toward the administrative building. Torres watched Julia disappear into the processing center, and he wondered what kind of storm was about to break over this quiet desert camp. The processing building smelled of disinfectant and dust. The women were lined up alphabetically, given numbers, photographed, and searched for weapons or contraband. When Julia's turn came, the female nurse, a stern-faced woman named Lieutenant Patricia Moore from Ohio, paused when she saw the pregnancy. "How far along?" she asked in broken Italian. Julia understood enough English to answer. 7 months, she said quietly. "Maybe more." Moore's expression softened slightly. She had 3 children of her own back home. She motioned for Julia to sit on a bench. "Wait here," she said, then disappeared into an office. Captain Harold Henderson was the camp commander, a West Point graduate in his late 30s who ran Camp Florence with bureaucratic precision. He did not like surprises. When Private Kaufman burst into his office talking about a pregnant Italian prisoner, Henderson felt a headache beginning behind his eyes. He listened to the report, then called Lieutenant Moore. Together they examined Julia in the medical building. Henderson stood awkwardly in the corner while Moore conducted a basic examination. The baby was healthy. Julia was malnourished and exhausted, but otherwise stable. Due date, late December, maybe early January. Henderson studied the woman sitting on the examination table. She kept her eyes down, her hands folded over her belly. He had read her file on the train manifest. Fascist translator. Relationship with German officer. No living family. Marked as potential security risk and hostile to Allied forces. But sitting here in the harsh light of the medical building, she just looked young and scared. Henderson sighed. "Ask her," he told Moore, "if the father was German." Moore translated. Julia nodded once, her jaw tight. "Ask her if she has anyone. Family, friends, anyone who could help," Moore asked. Julia shook her head. "Nessuno," she whispered. "No one." Henderson made his decision. "She cannot stay in the general barracks," he told Moore. "The other prisoners will cause problems. We saw what happened in the British camps, collaborators getting attacked, beaten. We cannot have that here." He paused, thinking. "Put her in the isolation building, not as punishment, for protection. Assign 2 guards, round the clock, and get her real food, not just rations. She is eating for 2. Moore nodded, relieved. She had been prepared to argue, but Henderson was ahead of her. "And Lieutenant," he added, "make sure those guards understand they are protecting her, not imprisoning her. Clear?" "Yes, sir." Julia was moved to a small building at the edge of the camp, a converted storage shed that had been used for overflow prisoners. It had a narrow bed, a chair, a small table, and a window with bars. But it was clean, and it was private. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, she heard American voices outside the door. 2 guards talking quietly. One was Torres, the other was Kaufman. They were not discussing how to punish her. They were arguing about whether she needed an extra blanket. The realization hit her like cold water. These men were not going to hurt her. They were going to keep her safe. For the first time in months, tears came. Hot, silent, unstoppable. The next morning, Kaufman brought her breakfast on a metal tray. He knocked softly before entering, which surprised her. Prisoners did not usually receive courtesy. She sat up as he set the tray on the table. Scrambled eggs, thick slices of toast with butter, orange juice, and coffee. Real coffee. The smell alone made her dizzy. She had not seen eggs in over a year. In Italy, during the final collapse, they had eaten boiled nettles and moldy bread. On the transport ship, she had received watery soup and hard biscuits that tasted like cardboard. This was a feast. Kaufman watched her stare at the food. "You should eat," he said awkwardly in his Brooklyn accent. She did not move. "It is not poison," he added, trying to smile. "I mean, the eggs are a little rubbery, but the cook does his best." Still she hesitated. He realized she was afraid it was a trick, or that it would be taken away, or that she would be punished for accepting kindness from the enemy. He picked up the fork, took a bite of the eggs himself, swallowed. "See? Safe." Then he set the fork down and stepped back. "Eat. Please. The lieutenant says you need to eat. For the baby." Julia picked up the fork with trembling fingers. She took a small bite. The eggs were warm, salted, buttery. Her eyes closed involuntarily. It tasted like a memory of normal life, of mornings before the war when breakfast was simple and good. She took another bite, then another. Kaufman watched her devour the meal with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. How hungry must she have been? How long had she been starving? When she finished, she looked up at him with something like gratitude in her eyes. "Grazie," she whispered. "Thank you." Kaufman nodded. "You are welcome, ma'am." The word ma'am surprised them both. She was the enemy. He should call her prisoner, or nothing at all. But something about her situation made the formality feel right. Over the following days, meals became a ritual. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Each time, Kaufman or Torres brought the tray. Each time the food was better than anything she had imagined. Stew with real meat, fresh bread, canned fruit. Once, impossibly, there was chocolate pudding. She cried when she tasted it, and Torres, embarrassed, pretended not to notice. The men began to add small extras, a packet of crackers, an extra apple, a hard candy. They told themselves it was for the baby. But really it was because they had started to see Julia not as an enemy, but as a person. A scared, pregnant, lonely person who had made choices they did not understand, but who did not deserve to starve. The isolation building was sparse, but not cruel. Lieutenant Moore brought a second blanket, a pillow, and after some hesitation, a small stack of books in Italian that had been confiscated from other prisoners. Julia handled them like sacred objects. She had not held a book in months. That night, as the desert cold settled in, she wrapped herself in both blankets and read by the light of a single bulb. The book was a battered copy of Dante's Inferno, of all things. She found bitter irony in that. She was living her own kind of hell, exiled, condemned, carrying the child of a dead enemy in a foreign land. But at least here, in this strange American desert, she was warm. She was fed. She was safe. Outside her door, Torres and Kaufman took turns on watch. The first night, they heard other prisoners shouting from the main barracks. Angry voices in Italian calling Julia a whore, a traitor, a Nazi lover. Some of the women had figured out why she was separated. The accusations carried across the compound, ugly and venomous. Torres stiffened. "Should we do something?" Kaufman asked. "Like what?" Torres replied. "They are just shouting. Let them shout. As long as they stay in their barracks, she is safe." But inside, Julia heard every word. She pulled the blanket over her head and tried not to cry. This was her life now. Hated by her own people, carrying a German child, dependent on Americans for survival. The contradictions were almost unbearable, yet something unexpected happened as the first week passed. The guards began to talk to her. Not interrogations, just talk. Kaufman asked about Turin, about the mountains, about Italian food. He was half Italian himself. His grandmother had come from Calabria, and he was curious about the old country. Torres asked about the war from her perspective. What was it like when Italy switched sides? What happened to people caught in the middle? Julia answered carefully at first, expecting traps, but there were no traps. These men were genuinely curious, and slowly, haltingly, she began to speak. She told them about her village, about the day the Germans arrived as allies and the day they became occupiers. She told them about Dieter, though she kept the details vague. He was a good man, she said. He hated the war. He just wanted to go home. Now he was dead and she was here, and their baby would be born in a prisoner of war camp in a desert she had never heard of until 2 weeks ago. The telling changed things. It is hard to hate someone once you know their story. Torres found himself thinking about Julia during his off hours. What would he have done in her position? If the roles were reversed, if he had been a Mexican translator in a German office, if he had fallen in love with the wrong person at the wrong time, would he have made different choices? He did not know. And that uncertainty made it impossible to judge her too harshly. Kaufman, for his part, started bringing her English-language magazines, with pictures, life, look, so she could practice reading English. "For after the baby comes," he said, "you will need to know English if you stay in America." The idea had not occurred to her. Stay in America? Was that even possible? Or would they send her back to Italy to face the partisans' revenge? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but for now, in this small protected space, she had food, shelter, and 2 young guards who had decided to be kind. It was more than she deserved, she thought, and far more than she had expected. The days settled into a rhythm. Wake at 6 when Torres knocked softly with a buenos dias that made Julia smile despite herself. Breakfast at 7, then a morning walk. Lieutenant Moore insisted on it. "The baby needs you to move," she said firmly. So each morning at 8, Julia would walk the perimeter of the isolation area with either Torres or Kaufman accompanying her. They walked slowly, accommodating her heavy belly, and they talked. About weather, about food, about nothing and everything. These walks became Julia's favorite part of the day. The Arizona sky was enormous, the air clean and dry, and for 30 minutes each morning she could almost pretend she was not a prisoner, but simply a woman taking a stroll. After the walk came the long empty hours. Julia read. She had worked through Dante and moved on to a collection of Petrarch's sonnets that Moore had found somewhere. She also practiced English from the magazines Kaufman brought. The language was difficult, harsh consonants and strange idioms, but she was stubborn. She copied out sentences in a notebook Moore had given her, practicing her letters. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. She did not understand all the words, but she repeated them aloud, softening her Italian accent, trying to shape her mouth around these foreign sounds. Lunch at noon. More conversation with whoever brought the tray. By the second week, even some of the other guards had started to stop by. Corporal James Mitchell, a taciturn man from Montana, brought her an old sweater when he noticed her shivering. "My wife is about your size," he said gruffly. "She would want you to have it." Private Rodriguez, who worked in the kitchen, occasionally added extra portions. "Growing baby needs food," he said with a wink, his own mother back in New Mexico pregnant with his youngest sibling. These small kindnesses accumulated. Julia kept a mental tally, a list of debts she knew she could never repay, but which made her feel less alone. Afternoons were for sewing. Moore had brought her fabric scraps and thread. "You will need baby clothes, she said practically. Julia, grateful for something to do with her hands, began to stitch. Tiny shirts, little blankets, soft caps. She was not a skilled seamstress, but the work was meditative. Each stitch was a prayer, a hope, a defiance against the uncertainty of the future. She sang while she sewed, old Italian lullabies her mother had sung to her. The guards heard the melodies drifting through the door and found themselves humming along, even though they did not understand the words. Evening brought dinner and the changing of the guard. Night shift was usually Torres and a rotating partner. Torres had taken a kind of personal responsibility for Julia's welfare. His own mother had nearly died giving birth to his youngest sister. Complications, hemorrhaging, a touch-and-go situation that had haunted his childhood. He saw something of his mother's vulnerability in Julia, and it activated a protective instinct he had not known he possessed. He made sure she had enough light to read by. He brought her herbal tea that the camp doctor said was good for pregnancy. He even once brought his harmonica and played soft corridos outside her door. Sad, beautiful songs about loss and home that needed no translation. But the isolation was not complete. Julia could hear the other prisoners in the main compound, their daily routines filtered through the thin walls, work details marching out to the fields, roll calls, arguments, laughter, and she could hear their anger directed at her. The women in the main barracks knew why she was separated. Rumors spread, the pregnant collaborator, the whore who slept with Germans, the traitor carrying a Nazi bastard. Some of the women had lost brothers, fathers, sons to German bullets. Their hatred was not abstract. It was personal, visceral, and it focused on Julia like a laser beam. One afternoon, 3 of the women managed to get close to the isolation building during a work detail. They shouted obscenities, spat in Julia's direction, threw pebbles at her window. Torres came running, bellowing orders, and the women scattered. But the message was clear. The guards could protect Julia from physical harm, but they could not protect her from hatred. That night she sat on her bed trembling, her hands on her belly, whispering to the baby in Italian. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry you will be born into this. I am sorry your father is dead. I am sorry for all of it." The baby kicked in response, a strong thump against her ribs. The sensation made her laugh and cry at the same time. Life persisted. Even here, even now, life insisted on continuing. Kaufman found her like that, crying and laughing simultaneously. He stood awkwardly in the doorway. "You okay, ma'am?" She wiped her eyes. "The baby kicked," she explained. "Strong kick, like a soccer player." Kaufman grinned. "A soccer player, huh? That is good. That is healthy." He hesitated, then asked, Can I feel it?" The question surprised them both. It was wildly inappropriate. She was a prisoner. He was a guard. But something about the isolation, the strangeness of the situation had dissolved normal boundaries. Julia nodded. Kaufman approached carefully, placed his palm flat on her belly. They waited. Then, thump. The baby kicked against his hand. Kaufman's face lit up with wonder. "Holy smokes," he breathed. That is amazing." For a moment they were not prisoner and guard, but simply 2 people marveling at the mystery of life. Then Kaufman stepped back, embarrassed. "Sorry, I should not have—" "Is okay," Julia said softly. "Is nice to share." Kaufman nodded and left, his mind reeling. He wrote to his mother that night. "I felt a baby kick today," he wrote. "An enemy baby, I guess." But it did not feel like an enemy. It just felt like life. Meanwhile, in the main compound, conditions were deteriorating. The Italian women were restless, angry, caught between identities. Were they prisoners of war? War criminals? Refugees? Nobody seemed to know. They worked in the camp laundry, in the vegetable gardens, in the kitchens. They were paid in scrip that bought them cigarettes and candy from the canteen. But they were also fenced in, watched, marked as collaborators. Some of the women adjusted, others seethed with resentment, and many focused their resentment on Julia. She became a symbol of collaboration, of betrayal, of the moral compromises that war forced on everyone. The fact that she was protected, isolated, given special treatment only intensified the hatred. "She sleeps in a private room while we are crowded 10 to a barracks," one woman complained bitterly. "She gets extra food while we make do with rations. Why? Because she opened her legs for a Nazi." The other women murmured agreement. Justice, they decided, needed to be done. Not everyone in the camp was hostile. Some of the guards, having heard Julia's story in pieces, became invested in her well-being. Lieutenant Moore checked on her daily, monitoring the pregnancy with professional efficiency, but also with genuine care. "You are doing well," she told Julia during one examination. "Baby is growing. Heartbeat is strong. You should be proud." Proud. The word felt foreign. What was there to be proud of? But Moore meant it. "You survived," she said firmly. "You survived war, loss, capture, transport. You are keeping that baby alive under impossible circumstances. That takes strength. Do not ever forget that." Captain Henderson, too, surprised Julia. He visited once, awkward in his pressed uniform, standing stiffly in her small room. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he said formally. She assured him she did. He nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "For what it is worth," he said, "I do not think you are a bad person. I think you were a young woman in an impossible situation who made the choices you could make. War does that. It forces choices that should not have to be made." Julia stared at him, shocked. He coughed, embarrassed by his own candor. "Anyway, if you need anything, tell Lieutenant Moore." He left quickly before she could respond. But his words stayed with her. Forgiveness, it seemed, could come from unexpected places. The breakthrough came one evening in late October. Torres was on duty, sitting outside her door, whittling a piece of wood. He had been making small animals, horses, dogs, birds, to pass the time. Julia watched through the open door, fascinated. "What are you making?" she asked in halting English. Torres looked up, surprised she had initiated conversation. "A coyote," he said, holding up the half-finished carving. "You have coyotes in Italy?" She shook her head. "We have wolves, lupi." "Wolves," Torres repeated. "I have heard about them, in stories." "My father hunted wolves," Julia said slowly, searching for words. "In mountains. Long time ago. Before war." Torres nodded, encouraging her to continue, and she did. Haltingly mixing Italian and English, she told him about her childhood, about her village in the shadow of the Alps, about her father who had died when she was 12, about her mother who had raised her alone and who would be ashamed of her now. Torres listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father died when I was 14. Farm accident, tractor rolled. My mother raised 5 kids alone. It was hard." He paused. "But she always said, you do not judge people until you have walked in their shoes. I think about that a lot here. None of us know what we would do in someone else's shoes." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Torres shrugged, uncomfortable with emotion. "Just saying." But it was more than just saying. It was absolution. And Julia held on to it like a lifeline. The coyote took Torres another week to finish. When he was done, he gave it to Julia. "For the baby," he said. "Something to remember Arizona by." She held the small carved figure, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It is beautiful," she said. "You are artist." Torres laughed. "Not really. Just something I learned from my grandfather." But he was pleased. That night, Julia placed the coyote on the small table beside her bed. It was the first gift she had received in over a year, and it represented something important. The idea that even here, even now, human kindness persisted. That enemies could become friends. That mercy could exist in the midst of judgment. It was a small wooden coyote, but to Julia it might as well have been made of gold. As November arrived and the desert nights grew cold, Julia found herself wrestling with questions she had avoided for months. Who was she now? What did loyalty mean when your country had collapsed, when the cause you had believed in revealed itself as monstrous, when the enemy showed more mercy than your own people? She had been raised to believe in clear lines, good versus evil, us versus them, patriot versus traitor. But those lines had blurred beyond recognition. The Germans, her supposed allies, had executed Italian partisans in town squares. The Italians, her own people, wanted her dead for loving a German, and the Americans, the enemy, fed her, protected her, carved toys for her baby. She began to write. Lieutenant Moore had given her more notebooks, and Julia filled them with thoughts she could share with no one. She wrote in Italian, pouring out her confusion and guilt. "I love Dieter," she wrote. "That should not be a crime, but to everyone else it is the worst crime. They say I betrayed Italy, but what Italy? The Italy of Mussolini, who led us into a war we could not win? The Italy of the king, who fled Rome and left us to chaos? The Italy of the partisans, who would rape and murder women like me without trial?" Which Italy was I supposed to be loyal to? The questions had no easy answers. She had joined the Fascist Auxiliary Corps at 19 because it offered work, purpose, and a sense of belonging. She had not been ideological. She had not cared about empires or racial theories or any of Mussolini's grand rhetoric. She had simply wanted to matter, to contribute, to be part of something larger than herself. Was that so wrong? And when she met Dieter, when she fell in love, was that wrong too? He had not been a monster. He had been a quiet man who loved music and books, who wrote letters to his mother in Bavaria, who hated violence and dreamed of returning to his family's bakery after the war. The fact that he wore a German uniform did not make him evil, did it? But then she remembered the things she had witnessed, the casual cruelty of the SS officers who passed through the logistics office, the deportation she had heard about but not questioned, the Jewish families who disappeared from Turin, their apartments looted, their fates unspoken. She had not participated directly, but she had been there. She had worked for the machine even if she had not understood all of its functions. Did ignorance absolve her, or did silence make her complicit? These questions haunted her, and they had no comfortable answers. Kaufman noticed her growing darker. "You okay?" he asked one morning during her walk. She nodded, but it was a lie. "You seem sad," he pressed gently. She stopped walking, staring at the distant mountains. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "about right and wrong, about what I did, about what I should have done differently." Kaufman was quiet for a moment, then he said, "My rabbi used to say we are all works in progress. Nobody gets it right all the time. What matters is what you do next." Julia looked at him. "But what can I do? I am prisoner. I have no future, only this." She gestured at the camp, at her belly. Kaufman shook his head. "You have a baby. That is a future. That baby will need a mother who tried to be better. That is something." It was a simple thought, but it lodged in Julia's mind like a seed. The tension in the main camp reached a breaking point in mid-November. A group of prisoners, led by a woman named Francesca, a former partisan sympathizer who had been captured by the Germans and forcibly conscripted into the Auxiliary Corps, began openly calling for Julia to face justice. They circulated a petition demanding that Julia be tried by a prisoner tribunal. "She collaborated willingly," Francesca argued to anyone who would listen. "She chose a German over her own people. She deserves to be punished." Captain Henderson refused the petition. "This is an American military camp," he said firmly. "We do not hold tribunals. We follow Geneva Convention rules. Rossi is a prisoner of war, same as the rest of you. She will be treated according to military law, not mob justice." But the anger did not dissipate. It festered. The women in the main barracks whispered and plotted. Some talked openly about finding a way to get to Julia. Others were more cautious, afraid of American reprisals. But the desire for revenge simmered constantly. Torres and Kaufman heard the rumors. They increased their vigilance, never leaving Julia's building unguarded. Henderson assigned a third guard to the night shift. "I do not want any incidents," he told his men. "If those women get to Rossi, it will be an international embarrassment. We protect her. Understood?" They understood. Julia sensed the danger. She heard the shouting from the main compound growing louder, more frequent. She saw the way some of the women glared at her during the rare moments when she was visible from the main yard. Fear became her constant companion. She slept poorly, waking at every sound, her heart pounding. The baby seemed to sense her anxiety, kicking restlessly. Lieutenant Moore prescribed mild sedatives, but they did little to help. "I am afraid," Julia admitted to Moore during one examination, "I am afraid they will hurt my baby." Moore gripped her hand firmly. "We will not let that happen," she promised. "You have my word." But promises could only do so much. One night in late November, a group of 4 women from the main barracks attempted to reach the isolation building. They waited until after midnight, then used a work detail distraction to slip out of their quarters. They moved quietly through the shadows, armed with improvised weapons, a knife stolen from the kitchen, a sock filled with rocks, broken glass wrapped in cloth. Their plan was simple: break into Julia's room, beat her, maybe kill her, and claim it was justice. They had nearly reached the building when Torres, on night patrol, spotted them. He shouted an alarm. Kaufman and 2 other guards came running. The women scattered, but not before Torres recognized Francesca. The next day, Francesca and her co-conspirators were placed in solitary confinement. Henderson assembled the entire prisoner population and delivered a harsh speech. "There will be no vigilante justice in this camp," he said coldly. "Any further attempts to harm Rossi will result in extended solitary confinement and loss of all privileges. This is not negotiable." The incident shook Julia badly. She had known she was hated, but the reality of that hatred, the willingness of her fellow prisoners to kill her and her unborn child, was almost unbearable. She spent the next week barely eating, barely speaking. Torres sat with her one evening, his harmonica silent in his hands. "You are safe," he told her. "We will not let them hurt you." She shook her head. "They will always try. Even if not here, later. When war ends, when I go back, they will find me. Torres had no answer to that, because she was probably right. The hatred ran too deep. The wound of collaboration was too raw. Julia would never truly be safe in Italy again. The realization settled over both of them like a cold fog. In early December, as Julia entered her 9th month, Lieutenant Moore brought her unexpected news. "Captain Henderson has contacted the Red Cross," she said. "He is trying to arrange for you to stay in America after the war. As a refugee, maybe, or under some kind of protected status." Julia stared at her, not daring to hope. "Is possible?" Moore shrugged. "We do not know yet. The bureaucracy is complicated, but Henderson is trying. He thinks sending you back to Italy would be a death sentence." The words hung in the air. Death sentence. It was not hyperbole, it was simply the truth. And the fact that an American military officer was working to prevent that fate, working to save the life of an enemy prisoner, was almost incomprehensible to Julia. She thought about the Americans constantly now, their strange mixture of rules and mercy, their insistence on procedure even when emotions ran high, their willingness to protect someone they had every reason to hate. It was so different from what she had known. In Italy, under both fascism and the chaos that followed, loyalty had been tribal, personal, bloody. You protected your own and you destroyed your enemies without mercy. But the Americans seemed to operate according to different principles. Principles that valued life, even enemy life, as something worth preserving. It was not weakness, she realized. It was a different kind of strength. One afternoon, while walking with Torres, she asked him about it. "Why you protect me? I am enemy." Torres thought about it. "You are pregnant," he said finally. "That is enough reason. But also, I do not know. I guess I do not see you as the enemy. I see you as a person who got caught up in something bigger than yourself. Same as me. Same as all of us." He paused. "My grandfather used to say, 'War makes enemies out of people who would be friends in peacetime.' I think about that a lot. You and me in another life, we could have been neighbors. Friends. The war made us enemies. But that does not mean we have to act like enemies." Julia felt something shift inside her. This was the deeper truth, the one she had been circling around for weeks. The Americans were showing her a different way of being human. Not perfect. She had seen their own prejudices, their own capacity for cruelty in other contexts. But here in this moment, they were choosing mercy over revenge. They were choosing to see her humanity rather than just her allegiance. And that choice mattered. It changed things. It changed her. She began to understand what her baby would inherit. Not just a confused legacy of Italian and German blood, not just the stigma of being born from a forbidden love, but also this. The knowledge that mercy is possible. That enemies can choose to be kind. That the world, however dark, still contains people who will do the right thing even when it is difficult. It was a lesson worth learning. And she wanted her child to know it. "If I stay in America," she said to Torres, "I will teach my child about you. About what you did. So they know that good people exist. Even in war." Torres looked embarrassed. "I am just doing my job, ma'am." "No," Julia said firmly. "You are doing more. You are being human. That is rare. That is precious." Torres did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and they continued their walk in companionable silence. The baby came on December 18th, 3 days before the winter solstice. Julia had been feeling contractions since dawn, but she said nothing, afraid of causing trouble. By noon, the pain was too intense to hide. Lieutenant Moore examined her and immediately called for the camp doctor. "This baby is coming today," she said crisply. "Get her to the medical building, now." Torres and Kaufman helped Julia walk across the compound. Every prisoner and guard stopped to watch. The pregnant Italian finally giving birth. Some faces showed hatred, others showed curiosity. A few showed something like sympathy. Julia kept her head down, focusing on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other. The medical building was small and under-equipped, designed for basic treatment of minor injuries, not childbirth. But Dr. Feldman, a middle-aged physician from Chicago, did his best. He had delivered babies before, during his residency in a city hospital. He could manage this. Lieutenant Moore assisted. Torres and Kaufman waited outside, pacing nervously like expectant fathers. Other guards joined them. Even Captain Henderson came by, standing awkwardly with his hands in his pockets. "She going to be okay?" he asked. "Doctor says yes," Torres replied, "but you never know with childbirth. My mother nearly died." Henderson nodded grimly. They waited. Inside, Julia labored for 6 hours. The pain was immense, biblical, all-consuming. She screamed in Italian, cursed God and the war, and Dieter for being dead and leaving her alone. Moore held her hand, murmuring encouragements. "You are strong. You can do this. Breathe. Push. Breathe." And finally, as the winter sun set and the desert sky turned purple, the baby came. A boy, small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly, announcing his arrival with furious wails. Dr. Feldman cut the cord, cleaned the baby, and handed him to Julia. She held her son, this tiny, fierce creature, and wept. "Dieter," she whispered. "His name is Dieter. For his father." Moore stepped outside to deliver the news. "It is a boy. Mother and baby are healthy." The men erupted in relieved cheers. Torres found himself grinning uncontrollably. Kaufman wiped his eyes, embarrassed by his own emotion. Henderson allowed himself a small smile. "Good," he said. "That is good." He paused, then added, "Make sure they have everything they need. Extra blankets, good food, whatever they need." The men nodded. They would take care of them. This had stopped being about duty a long time ago. This was personal now. Julia stayed in the medical building for 3 days, recovering. The guards took turns visiting, bringing small gifts. Torres carved a small wooden horse for little Dieter. Kaufman brought a tiny sweater his mother had sent from Brooklyn. Corporal Mitchell donated a blanket his wife had knitted. Even some of the guards who had been neutral or skeptical found themselves drawn in. There was something about the baby, his innocence, his helplessness, his complete indifference to the politics and hatreds that had shaped his existence, that cut through cynicism. He was just a baby. And babies, everyone agreed, deserved protection. But not everyone felt that way. In the main compound, Francesca and her allies seethed. "The collaborator gets her Nazi baby and now she is a hero?" Francesca spat. "This is obscene." Some of the other women agreed, but others, hearing about the birth, felt differently. One older woman, a former nurse named Rosa, said quietly, "She is a mother now. Whatever else she did, she is a mother. We do not hurt mothers and babies. That makes us as bad as the ones who hurt us." The comment sparked debate. Not everyone was convinced, but it planted seeds of doubt. Maybe some of the women began to think there were limits. Maybe some things were more important than revenge. On the 4th day, Julia returned to her small building with her son. The room had been transformed. The guards had built a wooden cradle. Moore had provided cloth diapers, baby blankets, and a small supply of powdered formula in case Julia's milk was insufficient. There was even a mobile hanging above the cradle, small carved animals that Torres had made: coyote, horse, rabbit, bird. Julia stood in the doorway holding her baby, overwhelmed. "You did all this?" she asked. Torres shrugged. "Kid needs a proper place. Could not have him sleeping in a box." Julia set Dieter in the cradle gently, then turned to the men. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for everything. You saved us. You saved our lives." Kaufman shuffled his feet, embarrassed. "Just doing what is right, ma'am." But it was more than that, and they all knew it. That night, alone with her son, Julia held him close and whispered promises. "I will keep you safe," she said in Italian. "I will teach you to be good. I will teach you that the world is complicated, that people are complicated, but that kindness is always possible. I will teach you about your father, who loved you even though he never met you. And I will teach you about these American soldiers, who became your protectors even though they did not have to. You will know that enemies can be kind, that mercy exists, that hope survives, even in the hardest places." Dieter yawned, oblivious, and fell asleep in her arms. Julia looked at his tiny face and felt something she had not felt in years. Not quite happiness, but maybe the beginning of peace. The weeks after Dieter's birth brought a new rhythm. Julia's days were consumed with the endless tasks of caring for an infant, nursing, changing, soothing, sleeping in fragments. The guards adapted. They learned to walk quietly past her building during the baby's naps. They brought supplies without being asked. Torres became particularly devoted, stopping by multiple times a day to check on them. "How is the little guy?" he would ask, peering at Dieter with the fascinated wonder of someone who had never been around babies. Julia would smile tiredly and give updates. "He ate well today? He slept 3 hours straight last night. He is strong." These mundane details became the substance of their conversations, replacing talk of war and politics with the simple realities of new life. Lieutenant Moore visited daily, monitoring both mother and baby with professional care. "You are doing well," she told Julia during one checkup. "Some women struggle after birth, but you are managing. Dieter is thriving. You should be proud." There was that word again. Proud. It still felt strange. But holding her healthy son, seeing him gain weight and grow stronger, Julia began to feel something like pride. She had survived. Against all odds, she had brought this child safely into the world. That counted for something. That mattered. In January 1945, Captain Henderson received news from the Red Cross. Julia's request for refugee status in America was being processed. It would take time, months, maybe longer, but there was hope. If approved, she and Dieter could stay in America after the war, resettled somewhere far from the camps, given a chance to start over. Henderson delivered the news personally. Julia wept when she heard it. I can stay? Dieter can grow up here? Henderson nodded. Nothing is certain yet, but we are trying, and I am cautiously optimistic. He paused, then added, You have suffered enough, Mrs. Rossi. You deserve a chance at a normal life. The formal title, Mrs. Rossi, shocked her. She was not married. Dieter was illegitimate by every legal and social standard, but Henderson had chosen to grant her dignity. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. The war dragged on through the winter and into spring. News filtered into the camp. Allied advances in Europe, the fall of Berlin, the death of Hitler, finally VE Day in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners in Camp Florence celebrated and mourned simultaneously. They were relieved the fighting had ended, but they were terrified of what came next. What would happen to them? Would they be sent home? And if so, to what? Italy was devastated, divided, chaotic. Many of the women had no homes to return to, no families left alive. They were displaced persons in every sense of the word. For Julia, the end of the war brought mixed emotions. Part of her ached for Italy, for the mountains and villages of her childhood, but another part of her knew that Italy held only danger. The partisan reprisals continued even after the war ended. Women accused of collaborating were still being beaten, killed, publicly humiliated. Julia knew she would not be safe there. Not with a German officer's child, not with her history. America, for all its strangeness, had become a kind of sanctuary. The guards had become her family. The desert had become familiar. She did not want to leave, and thanks to Henderson's efforts, maybe she would not have to. In June, the prisoner repatriation began. Women were processed in groups, transported back to Italy on ships, returned to a country many of them no longer recognized. Francesca and her group were among the first to leave. Julia watched from her building as they marched to the transport trucks, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Francesca saw her watching and spat in her direction, but the gesture felt hollow now, tired. The anger had burned itself out. Or maybe Francesca had just realized that revenge, however satisfying, would not undo the war, would not bring back the dead, would not fix anything. She climbed into the truck and disappeared from Julia's life forever. Others left more quietly. Rosa, the older nurse who had spoken against hurting mothers, stopped by Julia's building before she departed. She knocked softly, and when Julia opened the door with Dieter in her arms, Rosa's weathered face softened. I wanted to see the baby, she said simply. Julia invited her in. Rosa held Dieter gently, murmuring to him in Italian. Sei bello, she said. You are beautiful. Then she looked at Julia. I am sorry for how the others treated you. It was not right. You did what you thought you had to do. We all did. Julia felt tears sting her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Rosa nodded, handed Dieter back, and left. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and that was something. By August, most of the Italian prisoners had been repatriated. Camp Florence was nearly empty. Julia remained, her status in limbo, while bureaucrats in Washington argued over forms and regulations. The guards who had protected her prepared to leave as well, reassigned to other posts or discharged from service. Torres received his discharge papers in early September. He came to say goodbye, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. I am going home to Texas, he told Julia. Back to the farm, going to see my mother, my sisters, try to forget about the war. Julia held Dieter up. Say goodbye to Uncle Torres, she said in English, her accent still thick but comprehensible. Dieter gurgled. Torres laughed, touched the baby's cheek gently. You take care of your mama, little man. She is one tough lady. He looked at Julia. You are going to be okay. I know it. Julia did not trust herself to speak. Instead, she hugged Torres, briefly and fiercely. He patted her back awkwardly, then stepped away. If you ever make it to Texas, he said, you look me up. Torres family, outside San Antonio. We will have you for dinner. My mother makes the best tamales you ever tasted. Julia smiled through tears. I will remember. Torres nodded, gave a final wave, and walked away. Julia watched him go, this young man who had been a stranger, an enemy, and had become a protector, a friend, a symbol of unexpected mercy. She would never forget him. She would make sure Dieter knew his story. Kaufman left a week later, heading back to Brooklyn. His goodbye was equally emotional. He gave Julia an address written on a scrap of paper. My mother, he said. If you need anything, you write to her. She will help. I already told her about you. Julia clutched the paper like a treasure. Thank you, Danny. For everything. Kaufman shrugged, embarrassed. You gave me hope, you know. You and Dieter. You reminded me that life goes on, that good things can still happen even in bad times. So thank you, too. They shook hands, formal and inadequate. Then Kaufman impulsively kissed Dieter's forehead. Be good, kid. Make your mama proud. And then he was gone, another guardian angel departing, leaving Julia to navigate the next chapter alone. In October 1945, exactly 1 year after her arrival at Camp Florence, Julia received the news she had been waiting for. Her refugee status was approved. She would be resettled in New York, given assistance finding housing and work, allowed to stay in America as a legal resident. Captain Henderson delivered the papers personally. "You are free," he said, smiling, "or as free as any of us are. But you and Dieter have a future now. That is what matters." Julia held the papers with shaking hands. Free. The word felt foreign, but it also felt like possibility, like hope. The day she left Camp Florence, the remaining guards came to see her off. Lieutenant Moore gave her a thick folder, medical records for Dieter, recommendations, contact information for resources in New York. "You will need these," she said, "and remember, you are stronger than you think." Captain Henderson shook her hand formally. "Good luck, Mrs. Rossi. I hope you and your son have a good life." Even some of the camp staff who had been distant or skeptical came to wish her well. A cook gave her a bag of food for the journey. A clerk gave her a small amount of money, donations from the guards. "For the baby," they said, "to help you get started." Julia climbed onto the bus that would take her to the train station, Dieter in her arms, her few possessions in a borrowed suitcase. She looked back at the camp one last time. The barbed wire, the barracks, the isolation building that had been her prison and her sanctuary. She thought about the person she had been when she arrived, pregnant and terrified, expecting death and finding mercy. She thought about the guards who had protected her, the doctors and nurses who had cared for her, the bureaucrats who had fought for her right to stay. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, from a village in the Alps to a fascist office, to a German lover's arms, to a POW camp in the Arizona desert. It had been a journey through hell, but she had survived, and more than that, she had found unexpected kindness along the way. That kindness had saved her, and it had changed her. The bus pulled away, and Camp Florence receded into the distance. Julia held Dieter close and whispered to him in Italian, "We are going to New York, Piccolo. To a new life. You will grow up American. But I will teach you about Italy, about your father, about the good people who helped us. You will know where you come from. And you will know that enemies can become friends, that mercy is possible, that even in the darkest times there are people who choose to be kind. That is your inheritance, my son. That is what you must remember." Dieter yawned and nestled against her. Julia smiled, kissed his forehead, and watched the desert roll past the window. Behind her, the past. Ahead, the future. And in her arms, hope. Julia Rossi settled in Brooklyn, New York, in late 1945. With the help of a Catholic charity and the networks Danny Kaufman's mother connected her to, she found work in a textile factory. It was hard, repetitive labor, but it was honest work, and it paid enough to support herself and Dieter. She lived in a small apartment in a predominantly Italian neighborhood, where her accent did not stand out, and her past could be buried beneath the anonymity of a big city. She never returned to Italy. The risks were too great, the wounds too fresh. America became her home, not by choice at first, but eventually by preference. Dieter grew up American, speaking English with a Brooklyn accent, playing stickball in the streets, learning about his heritage in fragments. Julia told him about his father, the quiet German officer who had loved music and poetry, who had died too young. She told him about the war, about the impossible choices people had to make, about the gray areas where right and wrong blurred together. And she told him again and again about the guards at Camp Florence, about Torres with his harmonica and his carvings, about Kaufman with his magazines and his grandmother's stories, about Captain Henderson and Lieutenant Moore and all the others who had protected them when they were most vulnerable. Remember, she told him as he grew older, that when everyone said your mother deserved death, these men chose mercy. When your father's people and your mother's people were killing each other, these strangers chose to protect you. That is what it means to be human. That is what matters. Dieter absorbed these lessons. He became a teacher himself, spending his life educating others about the complexities of war, about moral courage, about the small acts of kindness that can change everything. He never forgot the coyote his Uncle Torres had carved, which his mother kept on her dresser until the day she died. It represented something essential, the idea that mercy cuts deeper than cruelty, that enemies can become protectors, that life persists even in the hardest soil. And so the blanket given in an Arizona desert, the soup served to a frightened prisoner, the guard standing watch not to imprison but to protect. These small acts echoed forward through generations. They proved that even in total war, even when nations demand absolute hatred, individual human beings can choose differently. They can choose to see the person rather than the enemy. They can choose to value life over vengeance. That choice, more than any weapon or strategy, is what ultimately defeats the logic of war. It is what allows us to remain human when everything pushes us toward monstrosity. As one of the guards, Corporal James Mitchell, wrote to his wife from Camp Florence in December 1944, "We are protecting an Italian girl who everyone says should die, but she is pregnant and scared, and I cannot bring myself to hate her. Maybe that makes me weak, or maybe that is the only way any of us stay decent. I do not know. But I know that when this war is over, I want to be able to look my own children in the eye and tell them I did the right thing. Protecting this girl and her baby, that feels like the right thing. And that is the story worth remembering. The story of Giulia Rossi, the pregnant Italian prisoner. The story of Dieter, the child born in captivity who grew up to teach about mercy. And the story of Sergeants Torres and Kaufman, Lieutenant Moore, Captain Henderson, and all the others who chose kindness when it would have been easier to choose cruelty. They reminded us that enemies are never just enemies. They are people. And people, if we let them, can surprise us with their capacity for decency. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about war, mercy, and what it means to be human, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. These forgotten stories from World War II still have so much to teach us about ourselves, about our capacity for both cruelty and kindness, about the choices we make when everything is at stake. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And remember, in your own life, when you are faced with the choice between judgment and mercy, between hatred and understanding, choose mercy. Choose to see the person. That choice matters more than you know. Thank you for watching, and never forget these stories.